The sun had burned white for days, and the wind that dragged itself across the desert carried nothing but dust and thirst. The wagon's wheels groaned like old bones as they turned through the rutted road leading north, past the mesquite and scrub where even the ravens had given up their cries. Clara Wren held the reins with raw, cracked hands, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. The two children beside her, Thomas and Ruth, were small shapes under a threadbare blanket, their faces grey with hunger and the long silence of loss. It had been 3 months since her husband's fever took him, 3 months since the mine debtors turned her away with threats instead of mercy. She'd sold the mule, the stove, and the wedding chest, and now the only thing of worth she still carried was the thin band of gold on her finger. The land grew wide and empty as the day waned. The light stretched thin over the plain, and the smell of dry sage rose sharp in her nose. Ahead, she saw it, Barclay Ranch, sprawled low against the foothills, fences half broken, a few cattle grazing near a windmill that turned lazily in the heat. Smoke lifted from the chimney of a house that looked more like a fortress than a home. She stopped the wagon at the gate, her throat aching. Her voice had forgotten gentleness. "Stay here," she whispered to the children. She stepped down, her boots sinking in the dust. Her skirt brushed the ground, heavy with dirt and travel. A figure came from the barn, a man tall enough to make the horizon seem closer, shoulders wide beneath a faded coat, his gait marked by a limp that said he'd seen wars not mentioned in polite company. His hair was the color of iron and ash, his beard trimmed short, his face marked by a scar that cut across one cheek and disappeared into his jaw. "Help you?" he asked, voice low, rough from years of disuse. Clara swallowed hard, fingers twisting around the ring she'd hidden in her palm. She forced the words out before fear could stop her. "My children haven't eaten in 3 days," she said, each syllable heavy as stone. "Will you buy my wedding ring?" For a moment nothing moved. Not the wind, not the man, not even the flies circling the trough. Elias Barclay stared at her with the kind of stillness only grief could carve. Then he looked past her toward the wagon, saw the 2 pale faces watching him, and his jaw tightened. He didn't take the ring. Didn't reach for it or even glance at it. "No," he said simply. "Keep it," her heart sank. The word felt like a door shutting in her face. But then, after a pause, he nodded toward the barn. "You can put the wagon in there. There's work to be done if you're able. Feed's in the bin. Supper's on the stove if you're not too proud to eat." His voice carried no warmth, no pity, just fact, plain and unadorned. But it was enough. Clara's lips parted to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. Pride burned in her chest, bright and foolish. Still, when she looked back at her children, Thomas with his hollow cheeks, Ruth clutching her rag doll by one torn arm, she nodded. "I can work," she said. Elias only gave a short grunt in reply. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn, the limp in his step visible now, the outline of a rifle across his shoulder. The air smelled faintly of rain that wouldn't come. Clara led the wagon forward, her children following close behind. Inside the barn, the cool dark smelled of hay and old horses. A cat darted from the shadows. She unhitched the mare and rubbed its neck, whispering thanks under her breath. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to exhale. That evening, the ranch house creaked with the slow rhythm of wind and wood. Elias sat at the long kitchen table, his plate half empty. When Clara entered with the children, he didn't rise or speak, only gestured toward the pot on the stove. She ladled stew into tin bowls and handed them to the children, who ate like they feared it might vanish. She waited until they were done before taking a small portion for herself. The broth was thin but hot, and for a moment, the ache in her chest eased. Elias watched her from across the table, silent as stone. His eyes were pale, like washed-out blue glass, and in their stillness, she sensed not judgment, but weariness. "You from East?" he asked finally. "Missouri," she said. "Long road," he murmured. She nodded. "Too long," he said nothing more. The wind rattled the shutters, and the fire popped in the stove. After a time, he stood. "There's a cot in the loft. You can sleep there tonight." "I'll take the barn," she said quickly. "We'll not trouble you." His gaze sharpened. Not anger, not kindness, just something unreadable. "Barn's colder," he said. "Children don't need cold." Then he walked out, his boots thudding on the wooden floor, the screen door snapping shut behind him. Clara sat there in the hush, the stew cooling in her bowl. The children had already drifted toward sleep. She looked at the ring still clutched in her hand, its dull gleam catching the lamplight. Slowly, she slipped it back onto her finger. That night, lying beneath the sloped roof of the loft, Clara listened to the sounds of the ranch, the creak of boards, the soft snort of horses, the restless wind that swept across the fields. She thought of the man downstairs, the one who spoke little but carried silence like a burden. She wondered what ghosts followed him, and why, of all places, he had built his home so far from other voices. Her children slept beside her, their breaths soft and even. She closed her eyes and prayed, not for fortune, not for deliverance, but for one more day. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and the far-off rumble of thunder. And though she did not know it yet, the storm that had brought her here was only the first of many. Emotional tone and realization. Bleak, wind-chapped, and quietly desperate. Two souls hardened by grief cross paths beneath a dying sun. Neither offers tenderness, yet in the unspoken mercy of a single act, refusing to buy her ring but feeding her children, something fragile begins to take root. The faint, reluctant start of human connection in a barren world. Morning came slow over the plains, pale light spilling through the cracks in the barn's siding like the breath of something waking. Clara rose before the children, her shawl wrapped close, her hands already numb from the cold. Outside, the wind was sharp with the scent of manure and wet hay. The world was wide and empty here, but it was steady, and for now, that was enough. Days bled into one another. She worked from dawn till dusk, her life a rhythm of chores and silence. Milking cows before sunrise, mending fences, scrubbing floors, washing clothes until her fingers pruned. The work was hard, but it steadied her heart, kept her from sinking into the long dark that had followed her since the fever took her husband. The children, though thin, began to find their laughter again. Thomas followed Elias about the yard, asking endless questions about horses and ropes, while Ruth took to feeding the barn cats milk from a chipped bowl. Clara watched them from the porch some evenings, her heart aching in that strange way relief could ache, the pain of seeing hope return after you'd buried it. Elias kept his distance. He was not unkind, but his kindness came wrapped in silence, like everything else about him. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were plain as gravel. Yet Clara noticed how often his actions spoke for him. A pail of fresh water left by the door, extra biscuits on the table, a small blanket folded near the fire where Ruth liked to sit. Sometimes, she would catch him looking out toward the horizon as if searching for something that never came. The way he stood, shoulders bent, hands rough from work yet still restless, told her he carried more than just solitude. One evening, while hanging linens near the corral, Clara wandered farther than she meant to. The air was still, the sky deep with the red fire of sunset. That was when she saw it. A small fenced patch of ground behind the corral, half hidden by weeds. She stepped closer. 3 wooden crosses stood there, worn smooth by wind and years. The names were simple, carved by hand. Matthew Barclay. John Barclay. Samuel Barclay. The sight held her still. She traced the carved letters with her fingertips. Brothers, she thought. Gone long before the land turned quiet. Gone, perhaps, in the same war that had left Elias with the limp and the scar. A single flower, dry and grey, lay at the foot of one cross. It looked old, as though it had been placed there seasons ago and never replaced. She didn't hear Elias until he spoke behind her. They were boys, he said quietly. She turned. He stood a few steps away, hat in his hands, his face unreadable in the fading light. They fought for the Union, he continued. Didn't come back. I buried what was left of him myself. Clara's throat tightened. I'm sorry, she murmured. He nodded once. Everybody's sorry. "Don't change much." For a long moment, they stood together in the silence, the wind moving gently through the dry grass. When he turned to go, she wanted to speak, to tell him she understood loss, that she too had stood over graves until the earth itself seemed to close around her. But the words refused to rise. That night, after the children had gone to bed, she sat by the fire mending one of Elias's shirts. The fabric was coarse and sun-bleached, the collar torn, the shoulder patched before. As she turned it over in her lap, she found a small hole near the back seam. The edges frayed and stained faintly brown, a bullet hole. Her hands froze. She stared at it. Her heart caught between pity and something deeper. Respect. Perhaps, or sorrow for the man who wore silence like armor. He had seen death not as rumor, but as company. She sewed the tear closed slowly, each stitch neat and deliberate, as if she were closing an old wound that had never been tended. When he came in from the porch later, brushing the dust from his coat, she handed the shirt back to him without a word. He took it, studied her face for a long moment, and then said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she replied softly, "but I wanted to." He nodded, eyes falling to the thread that still hung loose at the collar. "We do what the Lord lets us," he said, almost to himself. Clara folded her hands in her lap, the fire's glow painting gold on her skin. "And what does he let you do, Mr. Barclay?" He looked into the flames. "Work, keep to myself. Bury what's gone." His voice was low, almost steady. But behind it, she heard the tremor of a man who'd forgotten what it felt like to be forgiven for surviving. After that night, something quiet shifted between them. He didn't speak more, but when he did, there was less distance in his tone. The children began calling him Mr. Eli instead of Sir. He let them, though he never smiled outright. Clara found herself humming while she worked, the sound small but real. She began sweeping the porch each morning, setting coffee on the table before he came in from the fields. He never asked her to, but he always drank it. There were still nights when grief rose like a tide and caught her off guard. Nights when she clutched her shawl and remembered the fevered face of the man she'd buried under a cottonwood tree. But those nights grew fewer. Here, in this barren place, she had found something unexpected. Rhythm. Purpose, the faint outline of peace. Sometimes, she would catch Elias standing at the edge of the field at dusk, hat in hand, watching the horizon where the sun bled into the hills. He looked like a man waiting for ghosts to speak. Once she walked out to stand beside him. Neither said a word, but when the wind came, stirring the wheat and their hair alike, it carried no sorrow. Only the small, wordless truth that they were not alone anymore. Emotional tone and realization, reflective, tender, and filled with unspoken understanding. The days settle into rhythm, and the silence between Clara and Elias becomes less a barrier and more a bond. Through work, shared loss, and quiet gestures, a mended shirt, a graveyard tended, they begin to see each other not as burdens, but as living proof that pain, endured long enough, can turn into gentleness. The wind changed before the clouds came. Elias knew it in the way the horses grew restless, stamping and tossing their heads toward the western ridge. The air grew heavy with that strange metallic scent that always came before a storm, the smell of iron and memory. By noon, the horizon had turned black as spilled ink, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Clara was inside, kneading dough with sleeves rolled high. The children were gathering kindling by the porch, laughing at their own small bravery as thunder grumbled far off. She looked up when the first gust struck the window panes, her breath catching. It wasn't the storm that frightened her. It was how quickly peace could be taken away. The rain came suddenly, a sheet of silver swallowing the light. The sky cracked with lightning that lit the plain in white fire. Elias shouted to the children, pulling them inside just as the downpour broke. The wind slammed the door behind them, rattling the hinges. For a moment all the world was rain and noise and the smell of wet earth. Then, through the curtain of water, came the sound of hooves. At first it was faint, a rhythm almost mistaken for thunder, but it grew closer, sharper, until a lone figure appeared through the downpour. A horse slogging through the mud, its rider hunched against the storm. Elias reached for his rifle by the door. The rider dismounted and strode toward the porch, boots splashing through puddles. He was a man in his late 30s, lean and sharp-featured, with eyes that never stopped moving. His coat dripped rain, and when he pulled his hat back, his smile cut through the storm like a blade. "Evenin'," he said, voice smooth and practiced. "Name's Reed Dalton. Reckon I'm looking for a Mrs. Clara Wren." The name struck her like a slap. She froze, flour still on her hands. Elias looked from the stranger to her. "You know him?" Clara swallowed, voice trembling. "My husband. He used to work with him. Back when he was prospecting near Las Cruces." Reed tipped his hat slightly, though the gesture held no respect. "Worked with him, yes, and left some business unfinished when he went and died. Seems he owed me a fair sum. Money lent on good faith." His gaze slid toward her hand. "And he left behind a little trinket that rightfully ain't his to leave. A gold band, pledged against the debt." Her fingers curled around the ring unconsciously. "That's a lie," she said softly, though fear threaded her voice. "That ring was mine before the debt." "Before him," Reed's smile widened. "Ain't my fault the dead man didn't keep his papers straight." Elias stepped forward, the rifle low but ready. "This ain't the night for your business, mister." Reed's eyes flicked toward the weapon. "Don't mean no harm, rancher. Just stating my claim." "You've stated it," Elias said evenly. "Now ride out before the mud buries your horse." The rain hammered the roof like fists. Reed looked from Elias to Clara, studying her face as though savoring her unease. "I'll be back come sunrise," he said finally, mounting his horse. "With proof. With men who know the law." Then he turned and vanished into the storm, his figure swallowed by rain and distance. Inside the house, the silence that followed was almost worse than the thunder. Clara stood by the table, hands trembling, the old terror crawling up her spine. That sense of being hunted, cornered by debts she didn't make. Elias set the rifle against the wall. "You owe him nothing," he said, though his tone was more fact than comfort. "You don't know that," she whispered. "I don't even know that. My husband kept his dealings quiet. Too quiet." He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment she felt the weight of his gaze settle not on her fear, but on the years behind it. "I know a liar when I see one," he said, "and I've seen men like him before. They feed off the weak. You and yours are safe here." She wanted to believe him. Outside, the storm grew heavier, wind shrieking against the windows, lightning tearing the sky apart. Elias lit a lantern and placed it on the table. The flame flickered, throwing long shadows across the room. He dragged a chair near the hearth, sat down, and rested the rifle across his knees. "Go on and get some rest," he said. "Ain't no one riding back through that rain." Clara hesitated. "You mean to sit there all night?" "Long as it takes," he said simply. Her voice faltered. "You shouldn't have to keep watch." He looked toward the fire, its light burning gold in his tired eyes. No one should have to stand alone. Something in his voice, quiet, almost regretful, rooted her to the floor. For a moment she saw past the scar and the silence, saw the man who had once buried his brothers with his own hands, the man who had made peace with solitude because it was safer than losing again. She wanted to thank him, but words would only cheapen it. So she nodded instead, then went to the children's room, tucking them in as the thunder rolled closer. She sat by their bedside long after their breathing steadied, listening to the wind howl and the fire crack in the next room. Elias didn't move. She saw his shadow through the doorway, broad and unyielding, the rifle resting easy across his lap. Outside, lightning flashed, turning his outline into a silhouette of iron. When dawn crept pale over the wet earth, the storm had finally broken. The yard was a mire of mud and broken branches, the air washed clean. Clara stepped out, her skirts heavy with damp, and found Elias still there sitting by the dying fire, eyes fixed on the horizon as though expecting the world to test him again. "You've been awake all night," she said softly. He nodded once. "Old habits," she hesitated. "Thank you," he looked up, his voice low. "Ain't thanks I'm after, Mrs. Wren. Just peace enough for the both of us." She wanted to ask what peace looked like for a man who no longer believed in it. But she stayed quiet, standing beside him as the first fragile light touched the fields. For the first time since her husband's death, she did not feel alone. Emotional tone and realization, tense, intimate, and deeply human. The storm becomes a mirror for the fear that still rules Clara's heart, and Elias's quiet resolve becomes her shelter against it. Under the weight of shared danger, their trust deepens. In the storm's aftermath, something unspoken begins to root itself between them. Not love yet, but the fragile safety from which love might someday grow. The days that followed blurred into a silence thick enough to taste. Reed Dalton had not returned, yet his shadow stretched long across the ranch, lingering like a scent of smoke after fire. Clara Wren worked harder than ever, as if the rhythm of her hands could drown the unease in her chest. She scrubbed, stitched, and tended the hearth, while outside Elias mended fences and rode the pastures in a silence that was not unfriendly, merely measured, the silence of a man who had learned to live with ghosts. The children grew sturdy on cornbread and milk, their laughter timid at first, then brighter as the wind softened with spring. Her boy followed Elias from corral to stable, eager and wide-eyed, while her little girl braided strands of horsehair into bracelets. Clara watched them with a heart that hurt and healed in equal measure. At night, beneath the roof they now shared, the air was thick with unspoken things. Sometimes, through the thin walls, she heard Elias's chair creak, or the soft clink of his coffee cup as he stared into the fire. She would lie awake, the ring tucked in her apron beside her bed, feeling its weight like a promise broken and remade. Once, she caught herself watching him too long by lamplight, the way the glow brushed the scar on his cheek, the gentleness in the hands that once held a rifle. Her heart stuttered with guilt. She was a widow. He was a man buried beneath loss. Such longing was folly. But that night, when thunder rolled again across the plain, she found herself trembling on the porch, rain tapping like small fingers against the tin roof. Elias came to her, his voice low, his coat draped over his arm. "You shouldn't be out in the storm," he said. "I don't want charity," she whispered, her eyes shining in the dark. "I want to stand on my own." He hesitated, then laid the coat gently across her shoulders. "Then stand here," he said softly, "until you can." The rain fell harder, blurring the world beyond the porch. For the first time in years, Clara did not feel entirely alone. Emotional tone and realization, a simmering quiet before the storm. The tension is not of fear but of restraint, a yearning neither dares to name. Beneath the same roof, strength and tenderness begin to share the same breath. Both are learning that survival is not the same as living, and that healing can begin in the soft spaces where pride gives way to grace. The evening settled heavy and strange, a bruised sky swollen with thunderclouds, wind moaning through the cottonwoods. Clara sensed trouble before she saw it. The horses were restless, their ears flicking toward the darkening trail. Then came the riders, 3 of them, silhouettes cut against the dying light. Reed Dalton rode at the front, hat low, a smile like rusted steel. "Evening, Barclay," he called, reining in at the fence. "I've come for what's mine." Elias stepped from the barn, coat unbuttoned, the limp in his stride pronounced from the damp. "You've got no claim here," he said, voice flat as stone. Dalton laughed, glancing toward the cabin where the lamplight glowed. "That woman owes me more than she told you. Her man died with debts in my name, and that ring she hides is proof enough." Clara stood frozen at the window, heart pounding, her children clutching her skirts. She saw Elias square his shoulders, saw the rain begin to fall. "You'll ride off this land," he said, "and not return." The words barely left his mouth before a shot cracked the air. The horses screamed, mud splattered, and chaos swallowed the yard. Elias fired once, clean and quick. One man dropped. Another bolted into the storm. Reed's revolver flashed, the sound ripping through the rain. Elias staggered, hit in the shoulder, and fell to one knee as Reed vanished into the dark. Clara ran through the mud, skirts heavy, rain blinding her eyes. She reached him, hands slick with his blood. "Elias!" she whispered, voice breaking. He tried to wave her off, but his strength gave way. Together she dragged him inside, her breath coming in gasps. The children lit the lamp. The fire caught, warm against the cold. She tore strips from her apron, pressing them to the wound, her fingers trembling. "You fool," she murmured, tears streaking her face. "You should have let them take it." Elias looked at her through the haze of pain, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Ain't much use letting wolves feed." The hours passed slow. Rain softened to a whisper, thunder rolling away toward the mountains. Clara stayed beside him, washing the blood from his skin, her hands gentler than prayer. In the flicker of firelight, she saw not the giant rancher the town whispered about, but a man who had chosen to stand between her family and ruin. When he woke, dawn had begun to silver the window. Clara sat by the bed, weary but steady. In her palm lay the ring, the thin band of gold dulled by years and sorrow. "I was ready to sell this," she said softly, voice trembling. "Now I think I already have." He looked at her, eyes dark with understanding, and in that quiet moment the storm between them broke. Not with words, but with the small, undeniable truth that something new had taken root, fragile, fierce, and real. Emotional tone and realization, fierce, tender, and redemptive. Violence peels away all pretense, leaving only what endures, loyalty, sacrifice, and the beginnings of love. The storm outside mirrors the reckoning within. From fire and blood, they emerge bound not by charity, but by choice. The weeks that followed crawled by like wind through dry grass, restless, uncertain, heavy with rumor. Word of the gunfight reached the town before Clara or Elias could speak of it. The marshal came riding out one morning with 2 deputies, their badges dull with dust. Behind them trailed a wagon, and in it lay one of Dalton's men, pale and still, pulled from the riverbank a mile south. Elias stood straight, though his arm remained bound in a sling. He met the lawmen with the quiet steadiness of a man too tired to plead. Clara watched from the porch, her hands folded against her apron to keep them from trembling. When they asked for her account, she told it plain, that the men had come at dusk, that they'd drawn first, that Elias had stood between her children and a loaded gun. The marshal studied her a long time, then turned his gaze to Elias. "Reed Dalton's run off toward the border," he said at last. "You won't be hunted for what was done. The land's got its own way of balancing things." When they rode away, the silence they left behind felt strange, wide and clean. For the first time since her husband's death, Clara could breathe without fear. Still, peace came to her like a stranger she didn't know how to greet. The days lengthened, the fields turning green under the soft rains of spring. The children chased one another through the tall grass, their laughter carrying on the wind. The ranch, once brittle and gray, now breathed again, the fences mended, the soil dark and full of promise. Clara began to pack one morning, folding what few things she owned into a small trunk. She told herself it was time to move on, to find a town, a school, a place untouched by gunfire or ghosts. Yet her hands lingered over each item. Every sound, the creak of the porch, the low rumble of Elias's voice outside, pulled at something deep within her. When she stepped out, he was saddling her horse. His movements were slow, careful, the scar on his cheek catching the morning light. The field stretched wide behind him, and the sky, washed clean by the last storm, seemed endless. "I'm grateful for what you did," she said quietly. He nodded, tightening the strap on the saddle. "You don't owe me thanks." She took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I'd lost everything that could grow." Elias looked out toward the horizon, where the river cut through the green plain like a line of silver. "Home's where you plant your sorrow," he murmured, "and wait for something to grow." She stood still for a long moment, the ringless hand at her side trembling once before she reached for his. His fingers, rough and scarred, closed gently around hers. There were no words left between them, only the sound of wind through the mesquite, and the warmth of 2 hearts that had finally found rest. That evening, as the sun sank low and gold across the land, the cabin windows glowed with lamplight. Smoke rose thin and steady from the chimney. The ranch, once a refuge of silence and solitude, had become something else. A place where pain had turned to peace, and where sorrow, at last, had taken root in good soil, emotional tone and realization, quiet resolution. Healing through earned connection, no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures, only shared labor, shared silence, and the calm that follows long suffering. The land, once barren and hard, mirrors the hearts of its keepers, weathered, wounded, but alive again.